Dr. Caroline Sharp, thank you so much for your thoughtful and very generous introduction. Well, I want to say thank you again for the invitation to deliver the Beecher Lectures. It is my great pleasure to share my lectures with you. And this morning, as Dr. Sharp already mentioned, I will focus on another image of Jesus from a postcolonial perspective. Particularly, this morning, I will talk about the issue of global migration, which is a direct consequence of hundreds of years of Western imperialism and colonialism. The first section will evaluate the image of Jesus the Christian church preached during the Christmas season. And then the second will be a reading of Matthew's account of Jesus' escape to Egypt from a postcolonial perspective. Actually, postcolonial feminist perspective. Yeah. And then the third will present Jesus as a postcolonial child with some homiletical insights and some ideas. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he reminds us that while we might think you shall love your neighbor as yourself is the greatest command in the Bible, it is only found in one place, Leviticus 19:18. In more than 30 places, the Bible commands us to love the stranger. Even in Leviticus 19, the command to love our neighbors is followed by the command to love the foreigner. Moreover, the greatest migrant story in Christian scripture is of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ becoming a political refuge. Well, this is in Matthew 2, chapter 13 through 23. Unlike the stories of the Magi and the shepherds, this story is neither cozy nor nostalgic, but a fearful and dangerous story with the horrific scene of the massacre of the innocent children in the background. Modern theologians and preachers have considered this story historically unreliable and have often dismissed it from their theological and homiletical discourse. Biblical commentaries published before the 21st century focused on Jesus' divine leadership, divine lordship and sonship being protected by God in discussions of this passage. Moreover, as the liturgical scholar Stephen Burns points out, the annual festival of lessons and carols from King's College in England does not include the story of Jesus' escape to Egypt. Instead, the service of 9 lessons and carols that was developed in 1880 during the prime and high noon of the colonial expansion of England highlights the Magi and shepherd stories. The image of God in those stories is one who endorses travel to distant places, bringing light to darkened peoples, which comports with the colonial imagination and white European superiority. When I taught the prophetic ministry course, I asked the students if they had ever preached or heard a sermon about Jesus as a political refuge. All the students unanimously replied, never. They also indicated a reluctance to preach Jesus in terms of that image because it wouldn't sound like good news to their listeners. It would introduce an unwelcome note to the season of Merry Christmas. Consequently, the image of Jesus as a political refuge is rarely proclaimed in the Christian churches. But does the story, in fact, convey good news? And if so, what good news? Reading this story from a post-colonial feminist perspective does offer some insight into the good news in the story. The decision to read this story from a post-colonial feminist perspective concerns not only how to read it, but what to read. Such a reading prioritizes the unheard or left out voices of the colonized, especially the women who are the victims of the victim. The male biblical authors of the patriarchal imperial world hid the voice of women or reduced them to passing references, either wittingly or unwittingly. Now, functioning like a magnifying glass, a post-colonial feminist lens allows us to recognize the invisible or unattended colonized women in the biblical stories by zooming in on them. Such a lens allows us to reappropriate the stories by drawing out, extending, and giving voices to the women in those stories through a post-colonial imagination. The story of Jesus' escape to Egypt is also the story of colonized women. Mary, the mother of Jesus, plus the mothers of the infants killed by Herod, a vassal king of the Roman Empire. Yet, in the story, Mary is voiceless. And the voices of the mothers who lose their children through horrific imperial violence are simply echoed in a passing reference to Rachel's cry. Yet, although these women are on the margins of the story, a post-colonial feminist lens can bring them center stage and helps us see them more clearly. How then can we retrieve their voices to create a new meaning for preaching? That's our concern. Here, a post-colonial imagination plays a significant role. One of the functions is the analogical bridging of two different words. The first century Pax Romana and the 21st century Pax Americana. And the feminists perspective actually moves to and fro between them. And in the analogical process, interdisciplinary studies of the historical, socio-cultural, and economic conditions of these two empires are essential for identifying differences and similarities. New Testament scholar Warren Carter informs us that the oppressive imperial power of Pax Romana was supported by an imperial ideology that Rome was destined by the gods to rule over other countries. This religious ideology legitimized the oppressive colonial power through socio-economic, political, military, cultural, and legal means, and benefited the colonizers at the center and the upper levels of society, at the cost of the colonized who dwelt on the periphery and at lower levels. The story of Jesus and his family's escape to Egypt and the massacre of the innocent children illustrate the cruelty of Pax Romana in preserving its power, and the suffering and pain of the innocent people who were colonized. Even religious leaders who were supposed to raise a prophetic voice against oppression complied with it for the sake of their vested interests. Another New Testament scholar, Chad Myers, correctly states that this story is not a fantasy, but an archetypal portrait of the general circumstance of the Roman colonies, both before and after Jesus' birth. While Matthew embellishes the historical data of the infamous violence of Herod the Great in the story, the traumatic experiences of Mary and the other women in this historical setting could have happened at any time in any of the colonies of the Roman Empire. Human history is riddled with colonial imperialism. Pax Americana provides an example from the modern West. In his essay, The Task Ahead, the Presbyterian preacher and peace activist William Sloan Coffin asserts that just as the Roman Empire legitimized its territorial expansion with religious ideology, so the United States justified its angular territorial expansion throughout the last centuries with its religious ideological concept of manifest destiny. As Charles Evans Hughes, the Secretary of State from 1921 to 25, dispatched the Marines into Nicaragua for the 14th time in that country's history, he announced that America was seeking to establish Pax Americana. Thereafter, the US government invaded at least 21 countries in Latin America, and the US government participated in at least 26 CIA-led operations throughout the Caribbean basin to institute regime change. Pax Americana has benefited North Americans, just as Pax Romana did Romans. Now, the flow of migrants from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, and other Latin American countries along the US and Mexico border is one of the tragic consequences of Pax Americana. In the poem, Only Say the Word, written by Chicano poet Demetria Martinez, there is a conversation among three women, a Guatemalan Indian, a North American school teacher, and a Chimayo native. The Guatemalan Indian woman shares the violent post-colonial condition of her life like this. Wood, and ash. These are the colors of the people in Cordero, my village. We are dark, but lovely, strong, though now broken. We live in shadows of guns and jeeps. One by one, we are disappeared. Guards in green uniforms, like statues, come to life, terrified. After Mass on Sunday, they tore our saints out of niches, smashed out chalices, threw lots for altar clothes our grandmothers wove. My husband learned to read the Bible. He memorized the book of Luke. After a day in the coffee plantations, neighbors would gather to pray, to hear my husband read. Blessed are the poor, the kingdom will be ours. Then 10 men, no older than 17, the gleam of the devil in their yellow eyes, they beat my husband with rifles until his face was a bloody moon. I fell on top of him. I thought he was dead. Neighbors' cries, like those of dogs tortured for fun, rose to heaven. No guardian angels landed. My husband lives, but cannot smell the steam of tortillas and black bean, nor the scent of the body which bore his 4 children. He calls me his rose, but what is a rose without scent? A paper flower, flat, which no one will buy. Fear, like a fruit pit, is lodged in my husband's throat. He chokes in his sleep, weeps, speaks about escaping to the north. Like Jesus and his family, tens of thousands of children and their families have fled violence, death, and poverty in their home countries in Central and South Americas. They have left their countries to save their and their children's lives. Their hope for their children is less suffering and a better life. This may be the same hope Mary had for her son Jesus when she made the difficult and risky journey in Egypt at night, soon after giving birth. About the mothers who could not save their children from imperial violence, Matthew says, "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted." This poetic expression in Jeremiah 31, verse 15, depicts the agonizing pain of the colonized after the invasion of the Babylonian Empire. Matthew quotes this verse to depict the traumatic experience of the mothers under the Roman Empire. Now, we hear Rachel's desperate cry under the American Empire. The Guatemalan Indian woman in the poem continues to cry out like this. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. How many times have I said this prayer? How many Sundays have the people of Cordero, my village, held hands at Mass, begging you, Lord, deliver us from evil? It does not work. The prayer does not work. The words turned to stone in my mouth. I must find new words now, or I will choke. If the old prayer tires you, Lord, be patient. I will salt and stir my words, a brew so bitter you cannot resist forever. You will hear, God. You will answer. Where is our help? Christ Messiah, born of a woman who made love with life. Come down off the cross. That thorny crown is heavy. You have not lifted your head in 2,000 years. Come down off that cross, or we will call on our old gods. Give us this day our daily bread. Deliver us from madman's claws. Rachel's cry in this poem and Rachel's cry in Matthew's account correlate and help us imagine the suffering and pain of colonized women, both past and present. Like the Guatemalan Indian woman in the poem, the women in Matthew's account must have cried not simply to grieve the loss of their children and but in protest against God, shouting, "It is you who will be judged today. Your children are suffering, and you let it happen. They are hungry, they are ill, they are persecuted, and even massacred, and you watch in silence." What then is God's response to these cries? In the story, Herod is not able to kill all the baby boys. Through divine intervention, Jesus is able to flee the evil and arrives safely in Egypt as a political refuge. The colonial agent, Herod, cannot win against God. The colonial power of violence cannot rule over God's plan of salvation. In the Gospel of Matthew, the survival of Jesus as a political refuge is the germination stage of the new chapter of God's plan for human salvation. Matthew is silent about the migrant life of Jesus' family in Egypt. Egypt might have been not an ideal place for refugees. Yet, the story says that Mary and Joseph were at least able to protect their baby from Herod's sword until their return to their home country after his death. And so, the new beginning of God's salvation is inaugurated in Egypt, once the imperial power that oppressed the ancestors of the Israelites. How ironic. Jesus' survival as a political refuge in Egypt is the source of genuine comfort for the colonized, because God's hidden activity in Jesus gives them courage to live a life. It convinces them that God is working in order to make and keep human life human in ways that exceed our expectations. The image of Jesus as a political refuge represents the children forced to leave their countries by colonial and neo-colonial powers. From God's perspective, they are not annoying or unwanted. They are not obstacles or troubles. Instead, God in Jesus suffers with those who suffer both in the colonial and the neo-colonial worlds. And God wants to do something new with and for them. In this sense, Jesus is the image of a post-colonial child. Jesus, his identity as a post-colonial child is a metaphor that provides a model for a post-colonial way of living, not only for the victims, but also for all the people who live in our neo and post-colonial world. Those who suffer under the colonialism and neo-colonialism may reflexively recognize their own identity as God's agents through the image of Jesus as a post-colonial child. Perhaps those born with the privilege of U.S. citizenship may not be comfortable hearing about the oppressive power of Pax Americana, and might be uninterested in a sermon on Jesus as a post-colonial child. Nevertheless, preaching Jesus as a post-colonial child can help them redefine their identity in line with their significant function or role in God's salvific purposes. And such preaching is a call to live out life as God's agents for these particular times. How can such preaching happen? This is our main concern, I bet. We all preachers. There are many creative ideas, I think, not only mine, but also, from you, I think, I can collect some ideas. But I have only 10 minutes, so I will introduce, just share my two ideas. Yeah. I suggest that the post-colonial approach to preaching should appeal to the hearts of the listeners through both the cognitive functions of memory and the emotive functions of art. Walter Brueggemann sharply notes in his book, Tenacious Solidarity, that as the beneficiaries of Pax Americana, most American Christians are living in a self-sufficient affluence that produces amnesia. They conveniently forget their ancestors' histories of migration and regard contemporary migrants as an unpleasant interruption. According to a survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute in 2019, a majority of the members of white Christian churches are in a state of amnesia, with 67% of white evangelicals who participated in the survey supporting the building the border wall. And so too, 52% of mainline Protestants, including those of my denomination, the PCUSA. In such a context, preaching on the image of Jesus as a post-colonial child could refresh people's personal and collective memories that they are either migrants or the descendants of immigrants. While the cognitive functions of memory play a significant role in redefining who we are, the emotive functions of art complete preaching by inspiring listeners to participate in the process of God's humanizing politics. Preaching is, in essence, a work that demands the preacher's artistic sense and skills. A post-colonial approach to preaching can be rendered more artistic by coordinating material from the audiovisual arts with words. For example, although the story of Jesus' escape to Egypt has been painted by numerous artists, most of the results mitigate the fear and risk conveyed in the story by portraying Jesus' family as a white middle-class people riding a horse or a donkey under the guidance of an angel. In complete contrast, a couple of years ago, a student forwarded me a painting that depicting Jesus' family as a contemporary Latin American migrants in blue jeans, crossing a wilderness on foot, with the baby wrapped in a cloth on his mother's bosom. Well, I tried to find out that picture on this screen this morning to show you on the screen, but I couldn't find it. So unfortunately, I did not bring my computer, in which I saved my picture. Well, if this picture were to be presented in preaching, it would open listeners' eyes and hearts to imagining the biblical story in a totally different way. In addition, I think of the song Star Child as a post-colonial song of Christmas. While most Western Christmas music is either sentimental or exciting, this song, with words by Shirley Murray, makes us think about who Jesus really is. It sings of children in the margins of our world as street child, beat child, no place left to go, hurt child, used child, no one wants to know. This song also sings of Jesus as the symbol of hope. Hope for peace child God's stupendous sign, down to earth's child, star of stars that shine. In the refrain, it sings, this year, let the day arrive when Christmas comes for everyone alive. There are just a few possible ideas, these are just a few possible ideas for using art when preaching Jesus as a post-colonial child. When used effectively in a sermon, such creativity can narrow the gap between victims and the privileged in Pax Americana, and inspires us all to respond to the ethical question, as the Church of Jesus Christ, what must we do?